somebody had published an important book that was, I think, in 2010-11, the book Cooperation 2020, and that was, at that time, the visiting fellow at Yale University, Pavan Sukhdev. And then we found out that before that, he had even been special advisor and head of the UNEP's Green Economy Initiative and was the lead author of the report Towards the Green Economy. So who else was then the person to do the important report? He was an appointed lead of the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, and we are still trying to get action because of this very good report, and I hope, Pavan, you will give us another hint how we get really action going in the political arena. We welcome you.
I hope you've all enjoyed the sustainable food and stacked yourself on a lot of sustainable coffee. So, hint, hint. Thank you for the introduction, and today my task is to describe to you some of the issues that arise that are in common, in fact, between food and agriculture, not just in common in terms of flows from one to the other, impacts and dependencies, but common also in terms of thinking disciplines and planning and how do we organize solutions to another vast area of problems, as vast, I would say, as the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems, which was, of course, the topic of the TEEB report that you mentioned. From the TEEB report, I want to begin my story with just what I think is perhaps the most important message of this report, The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, and that has to do with the connection between rural poverty and ecosystems. And here's the way that we understood the problem, because ecosystem services, the goods and services that flow for free from nature to us, are basically a challenge because of their economic invisibility. No bee ever sent you an invoice. And yet, when you measure as a result of how much is the cost of bad bee ears versus good bee ears in terms of the value of fruit output around the world, then that answer is of the order of $200 billion. So you know what's the value of the services that the bees deliver without ever having received a single invoice from them. But this is just an example. There are many such examples of the economic invisibility of nature. And converting those examples into economics may sound banal, may sound even silly and immoral, but it is necessary because economics today is the language of policy. If you wish to communicate anything to policymakers with an end result in mind, choose economics, because that's the language that they understand. That's the reason why I went into this whole space and engaged myself as a study leader of TEEB. This example which I have for you here is basically about measuring ecosystem services and their values, and flood prevention, drought control, nutrients and freshwater flows, ecotourism, the whole jing-bang lot. And if we do that for countries such as Indonesia, India, and Brazil, we found that they were large, but not disturbingly large. In other words, in Indonesia, you could say that as a measure of value addition, they would be probably 20-odd%, 21% estimate of GDP. So there are missing elements which are not there in our normal thinking. Some of them are captured in a way, in an indirect way, because bee-based pollination means fruit is produced, which is sold, which is captured in GDP. But we don't know how much the value of that bee-based pollination is because nobody ever measured it, and so on. In India, it was 16%, in Brazil, 10%. That doesn't sound staggering. But the problem is we haven't posed the question correctly, because the question really should be, whose GDP? And if you do that, then you get a different perspective, because in fact, who suffers if the nutrients and fresh water from the forest through the aquifers to the fields of farmers don't happen? Well, obviously, it's the poor farmer who has to pay the price in terms of additional cost of irrigation or a decline in food output from his farms. Who suffers if the forests are not available to collect the fuel wood or any of the bushmeat and the goods that the forest provides for free? Well, it's the poor farmer's wife and family, because they don't have the means to cook and they don't have the means to get additional protein. Who suffers if the leaf litter from the forest isn't available Well, it's again the poor farmer because his cows and goats can't go into the forest to forage for leaf litter. So when we ask the question, having understood the problem more in detail, when we ask the question differently, not as, oh, what are ecosystem services as a fraction of missing GDP, but rather, what are ecosystem services consumed by poor households as a fraction of the GDP of the poor? That answer was surprisingly different. And that answer is for the 20 million in Brazil who gather nuts and forest products in northeastern parts of Brazil, in the Amazonas. That answer is more like 90%. For 100 million farmers in Indonesia, it's more like 75%. For the 350 million people in India who are dependent on either small-scale farming, sustainable or unsustainable, but they're basically subsistence farmers, and who are gatherers around the forests and fisher folk, local fisher folk, coastal communities, that answer is half, 47%. So ecosystem services are actually a huge part of the GDP of the poor. A lot of what comes to the poor comes to them. And then the question arises, well, the development strategies, the development policies and the development plans of many developing countries do not seem to recognize this economic reality. So how can they be really development plans if on the one hand they're destroying the GDP of the poor and on the other replacing it with something else? And there are many dimensions to this something else. One is the employment dimension, because we are talking about large numbers. I mean, try, for instance, for the billion-odd farmers that I'm talking about, to convert them into Ferrari manufacturers, for instance. How practical is that as a development policy? And these are the issues that really come to the head when you do the economics correctly and holistically, which is the way that we would like it to be done, and which is the way that the TEEB project recommends it to be done. The final question that comes to mind is that if it is that obvious, and if there is so much research, then why doesn't this just happen? I mean, why don't all development plans focus their government investments in public policy, target the increase in the GDP of the poor, and focus on investment in conservation and forests and wetlands and all these wonderful things that I'm sure would gladden the hearts of many, including I'm a board member of CI, delighted that Peter Seligmann is here. We'd all be very happy if this were just to happen, because it's understood that it makes good economic sense. But it doesn't just happen. And I've put in a lot of thought and research on understanding why. And I must tell you that why is this not happening? The answer is because it doesn't add to the profits of corporations. That is my conclusion, and it's one of the issues that I've dwelt upon in my book called Corporation 2020, which is the extent to which private profits have become a driver of almost every government policy around the world. And this is part of the challenge, I think, of what Guillermo, you referred this morning as dealing with food is all about dealing with systems and root causes. Well, here's a root cause that we need to worry about. It's the nature of today's corporation and what it does as a driver of policy and as a driver of outcomes in even food systems. Another project which was very much part of my recent life was something called the Green Economy Report, otherwise known as Towards the Green Economy. And this dealt with small farms and agriculture generally, but small farms particularly. And the reason that my co-authors, and we were, again, almost 500 of us there, chose to focus on the small farm is because we did believe that somehow today's discourse on agriculture did not give enough importance to the small farm. In fact, the discourse was too much geared towards, essentially seeds and fertilizers and pesticides. And to my thinking, it may have been that the discourse is almost captured by lobbies and by the industry, which is focused on seeds and fertilizers and pesticides. Because we hear a lot about GM versus non-GM crops and the issues around seeds and seed saving, and we hear a lot about intensive versus extensive farming and so on. But we don't hear enough about the importance of the small farm. But here are some statistics, including from Jules Pretty, whom I was delighted to find speaking this morning. So statistic number one, which has been mentioned this morning, was about 2.6 billion people rely on agricultural production systems for their livelihood. This is from an FAO report. And that represents more than 1 billion families. So this is the issue, that it's not only about food, it's about livelihoods. And many of these, of course, are poor families, so we can't merely ignore them. In terms of numbers, there are about 525 million farms around the world, out of which 400 million are less than just 2 hectares. That's small. That basically means that you are in subsistence farming of some kind, either that or in a rich country in hobby farming, but it's small. And those subsistence farms are actually accounting for something like 60% of the agricultural land on Earth, and a large part, probably close to half of the production. And the interesting thing about small farms is that because they represent poor families and poor rural households, because we need to focus on them for the 2 obvious reasons, that if we were able to increase the yields in small farms, we would be addressing 2 important problems. One is the problem of hunger, because very often distribution systems of food do not allow enough food to reach the areas where poverty is. And this is also areas of low farming and low output farming. And second, increase in yield in those small farms would mean more income in the hands of the poor, and therefore it is clearly a powerful solution towards poverty. In fact, some of the statistics that we put together on the report suggested that some of the best returns on investment, some of the best outcomes in terms of where you should focus for poverty reduction lies in this area of increasing the yield on small farms. Finally, another statistic, which is from Jules Pritien from FAO, and I was delighted that both were represented in the sessions this morning, so well done, Patrick, on getting all of the right people into this room here. But these are really interesting statistics, which in the case of Jules's study, related to something like 287 sustainable farming schemes around the world, covering more than 50 developing countries and cutting across more than 12 million small farms of various kinds around the world. So it's a significant statistic. It's certainly statistically a large portion, something like 3% of the arable land in these areas. And his result was, his statistical result was that as a result of sustainable farming methods in these 287 schemes, on average, the yields increased by 79%. So that's 80% more food. Now, just do the arithmetic mentally, and this is easy. Let's say it's 80% times 50%. So potentially we could be growing by focusing on these sustainable farming methods, be they low-tillage farming or no-tillage farming, or recycling farm water, or using farm manure, or rotating crop species, or using different strains of the same crop to avoid pest losses, or finding small farm storage, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole range of things that can and have been done in all of these schemes. And the net result is that, yeah, if this model could be extended, this thinking could be extended around the world, we could be producing 40% more food as a result of higher yields here. And once again, what does that do? Well, 2 very simple things. Solves a lot of the poverty problem and solves a lot of the hunger problem. So you would think, obviously, every government must be focusing all its policies on investing in small farms, ensuring that they have access to these techniques and that they are completely enabled to do exactly that. Yes? No, of course not. So why does this not happen? Why is this not happening? And once again, I did a lot of thinking about this. I come to food as just a bemused and puzzled observer, because this is not naturally where my area is economics and externalities. But when I look at it, again, I find the answer to these problems is because sustainable small farm agriculture does not add to the profits of corporations. In fact, if you think about it, the use of less fertilizers and less pesticides and the non-dependence on marketed genetically modified seeds would actually probably decline the profits of corporations. And since in today's world, the corporations, by the way, just a little aside, which is for those who may not be familiar with the statistics, but in the US, 75% of GDP and jobs are private sector. Globally, it's more like 70 and 60%. Today's corporation is the single most important institution of our times. Apologies to any members of the Church of England and others who might think. But because they are so important, it is no surprise that today's politician is beholden to the corporation. It is no surprise that today's politician, whose job is determined by getting ticks in the boxes of GDP growth, high employment, and balancing fiscal budgetary deficits, and lastly, and perhaps most importantly, funding campaigns. when you find the corporation is ticking all those 4 boxes, why should you not be listening to CEOs and looking over your shoulder all the time to the private profit impacts of your policies? And that's exactly what politicians do today. Today's politician, therefore, has become a follower, no longer a leader. The days of Mahatma Gandhi and Winston Churchill are long gone. Right? We are in a different world today. So here's the challenge, and I think this challenge is actually can be understood in terms of its impacts, and this is why I think so much in terms of externalities, because this challenge is one of private profits and public losses. And I illustrate this point to you, and apologies to the economists in the audience who don't need to be explained externalities, but here's an example for the others from South Thailand, which is actually from shrimp farming, so I think it's relevant to this audience. This study was done by Professor Ed Barbier and his team. He's an advisory board member of TEEB, apart from being a famous author on these issues of environmental economics. And they found that in South Thailand, the rush towards the conversion of mangrove swamps into shrimp farms was largely driven from a profit perspective. And here's the economics of it, which is that if you left the mangrove as it was, it would give you about $600 worth of value in fuel wood. Whereas if you convert it to a shrimp farm, and this is a period over 9 years, the value of that is about $9,600. But of course, you need to interrogate that result and see what about subsidies. And subsidies, as His Royal Highness also mentioned in his speech this morning, are an important area of concern for us. So in this case, if you take out the subsidies, the comparison is not that hot anymore. It's now $1,200 versus $600, but it's still in favor of the conversion of the mangrove swamp into the shrimp farm. However, when you start looking at ecosystem services and start valuing what nature delivers into society, then you get to evaluate things like storm protection and the fisheries. After all, mangroves are the nurseries of a lot of fish. And then you start, obviously, to putting values to those externalities, and you find they're huge and positive. So in fact, the mangrove's real value to society, the public benefits of the mangroves are more like 12,300 and not just 600. And if you work out the cost to society of restoring the land use for shrimp farming, basically because of salt and chemical deposition, it becomes unusable even for shrimp farming. So you need to restore that if you want to reuse it. So you need to factor in the cost of that. Well, that cost is an estimated $9,000. And when you've done all that, then the answer is, and this is the nub of my point, which is that it's no longer a question of looking at an unsustainable or an unprofitable option, which is keep the mangrove, but in fact, it is the profitable option. So depending on the lens that you use, whether the lens is one of private profits or the lens of public wealth, your answer, your trade-off, has a completely different answer. In one case, it is conversion. In the other case, conservation. Therein lies the challenge, but the bad news, I guess, from my side and from the research that's been done by Trucost, and I believe Richard is somewhere here in the audience, the CEO of Trucost. Yes? No? Yes, he is. There he is. So this result is from Trucost, and they have been collecting data for the last 12 years on the externalities of corporations, the top 3,000 companies. When they surveyed and calculated their externalities in terms of greenhouse gases and water abstraction and so on, they found that totaled up to something like $2 trillion, which is almost 3.5% of global GDP. And I think Ken had mentioned this morning that the need for cheap food has led to a food system that's built on externalities. Well, actually, many of these externalities are from the food sector. Now, one of the worrying points about these externalities is not just that they're big and that they represent private profits at the expense of public losses, but what exactly these externalities are. And I just highlight here 3 of them, which we are all familiar with: greenhouse gas emissions, water abstraction, and natural resource depletion. And if you look at planetary boundaries, in other words, the whole research done by the Stockholm Resilience Center, and you look at what's causing at least 6 of our planetary boundaries from being approached at a reckless pace, you will find the exact same externalities driving them. So it is very much about greenhouse gases driving both climate change and acidification, and about resource extraction being the cost of these externalities as well. The answer towards the solutions, if you like, are really in changing this agent of today's economy, the corporation. And there are, in my opinion, 4 important things that can be done. They have to do with accountable advertising. They have to do with reducing unlimited leverage, in other words, creating systems of limiting leverage, about resource taxation becoming the main form of taxation as against corporation tax, and, in my opinion, most importantly, about measuring and disclosing externalities. And the first steps towards this have been taken by the TEEP for Business Coalition in the report, again, commissioned by us, done by Trucost, which was about the top 100 externalities of business. Someone mentioned that it was coal-fired power in Eastern Asia, which was the largest, but the second largest was, and many of the other large ones, were agricultural externalities. And the one that's rather interesting here is cattle ranching and farming, which is a sector that generates about $17 billion worth of output, but its externalities are $350 billion. So it's 18 times as much as the value of the output. My friend Adam calls this whole thing dead animal arbitrage, and you can see why. But it is an amazing form of economic stupidity. We are soon going to explore this in more depth, but I'm not suggesting that our exploration, which is going to be called TEEP for Agriculture, to which I invite Patrick, you, and all of the people whom you've organized together for this conference. There's going to be a launch meeting to discuss what to have in this TEEP for Agriculture study, but essentially it's about studying the dependencies on nature of agricultural systems, the impacts on nature of our different agricultural systems, and making sure that in the process we create a good, solid body of evidence which policymakers can act upon and which is economically informed and economically expressed, because once again I emphasize that economics is the currency of policy. We will go into the science, of course. There is a little website here. If any of you wish to contact us, please feel free to do so, and you will definitely get an invitation to this launch meeting that's happening. We go in here very much in the TEEP spirit of open architecture. We invite people whom we know are relevant and interested. We do not go in with any predicated notion or ideas as to what exactly we shall study and so on. So this is very much an invitation to participate in a construction of a process and results of this kind. I close by saying that this is a very interesting time for us, and I think externalities, frankly, are the biggest free lunch in the history of this universe. I know we've had one just recently, but that was a small one. I hope that the small ones continue, but I do hope that we can stop the biggest free lunch in history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavan, especially the invitation. I think everybody's going to take it up. You will be surprised.
Yes.
I hope.
I hope so as well. Yes.
I hope so. And one important point to me was actually that it is clear that we have the situation that for too long, not people within agriculture earned their living from agriculture, but people from outside earned their living from inputs into that agriculture. And I think the time has come now to understand that it has to be the other way around. Could I invite the other 3 speakers, please, to come up here? And there's one point I omitted to tell you who I am. My name is Hardy Vogtman. I was once upon a time the first professor in organic agriculture at the University of Kassel. Later on then president of a state agency for agriculture and rural development. And my last position, that's when Pavan and I met, I was president of the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation. And now I'm representing the largest NGO for nature conservation, animal protection and environment, German League for Nature and Environment, with 5.6 million members. And that is our political weight. And we are going to use it even with our new government, because things are going wrong at the moment in Germany. So may I invite then the first speaker, Peter Seligmann. He is, I think, as the chief executive and co-founder of Conservation International, the person who brought about the change in the thinking and acting of Conservation International. I think he was very instrumental to have this shift done, and I think he's also very instrumental from his background as business, environment, ecosystem services, and conservation manager to bring together what he says, industry, government, religious leaders, scientists, local and indigenous people. And I think he is the man who could really get his vision into reality. And I'll tell you what his vision is. He thinks that the global shift in attitudes and action is required. We are working for this here in order to attain a world in which our Earth's natural wealth serves as the cornerstone for vibrant, thriving human societies. Peter.
Thank you. Before I really start, I was very lucky last night. I was invited to the premiere of an extraordinary movie called The Long Walk to Freedom, the Nelson Mandela story. And Nelson Mandela's daughters were there. And of course, in the middle of this film, text started moving around that Nelson Mandela had passed away. And I think that's just as we think about the conversations that we're having here and about all kind of the segmented thinking and different silos that we're concerned about, whether it's food or health or ecosystems. I think that what we really need to be aiming for, as opposed to compliance to these different segments, is a shift in our DNA. And I think that's really what happened as you watch this extraordinary movie, which I think you all should see, with Nelson Mandela. He didn't start out as a man that was only searching for peace. He was strong and fighting and throwing Molotov cocktails. But it was the evolution of realizing that the real enemy of peace is not just the oppressed, but the oppressor, and that they have to both be forgiven and brought together. And I think that for us to make the progress that we need to make, we need to be really thinking about how do we shift DNA, and it's the DNA of ourselves, but it's also the DNA of all the companies. And the really extraordinarily important moment that we're in right now is that we actually have a tool that is activating that, and that's the tool of social media. And the tool of social media basically says that we see you. We know you. You cannot be nice here and bad there. You can't solve problems with philanthropy. You can't solve problems with CSR. You actually solve problems by changing who you are and taking responsibility. And if you have the right core, you'll take care of employees. You'll take care of nature. You'll be concerned about health. And that tool is underutilized. Luckily, it's there. We can't stop it. It's global. Everybody's got the power. And that's, I think, the most important thing. That's the most important tool we have. Because with that tool, if we apply all the knowledge that is expressed that we heard today, it's extraordinary listening to the knowledge, whether it's endocrine interrupters or whether it's the quantity of waste. If we apply that social media power and disperse the knowledge we know, we will actually force adjustments and change. I am very optimistic about this because I'm seeing in companies, in corporations, whom I actually don't see as villains, but I see in companies a radical shift in many. I see companies actually as parents and as neighbors, as people who are trying to do the right thing like everybody else for their immediate group, but not necessarily knowing what to do. So I feel that there's been a sea change, and it's come about by this concept of enlightened self-interest. It's come about because we are now able to use externalities and the power of social media to show governments and leaders and companies what's in their self-interest. And what's in their self-interest is to be a partner, not a predator. And what's in their self-interest is to figure out how do they adjust their behavior and why is that beneficial to themselves. So whether it's a huge company like a Walmart or a Starbucks or a Unilever, what we're seeing is a shift in their assessment of sustainability. And I know that's what we're talking about, so we'll stick with that, but it's spreading to other parts of their behavior. And they're not doing it necessarily because they are altruistic, because I do not believe they are. They're doing it because they see it as being in their self-interest. Now, just as one example of the adjustments that we have seen just recently, many of you have heard the conversations that have taken place here about this effort to look at measuring the contributions that ecosystems provide to food production in Africa. It's an effort the Gates Foundation launched with Conservation International and the Earth Institute and organizations and research institutions in Southern Africa. And it was an effort to actually provide a metric, a tool that would allow nations and communities and businesses to put a value on the essential services and products that nature provides that food production requires, focusing on the smallholder farmer. It's become very, very impactful. And what we have seen, which is what I want to just kind of touch upon, why I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic today than I actually was yesterday, is that there are two major initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa right now focusing on expanding food production. One is called Grow Africa. And Grow Africa is connected to a whole range of big enterprises, the G8, the World Economic Forum, etc. And they really have been focusing on not sustainability, but quantity of food. And the concept has been, we can convert more land to ag, we can make more money. And sustainability will follow sometime in the future. That's really what has been driving this. A group of research institutions and NGOs tried relatively unsuccessfully to insert into that conversation the idea of, well, let's get the sustainability done up front. Let's actually use the data systems and the metrics and the vital signs effort to actually make certain that the type of farming, the type of land conservation, the protection of water sources and pollinators and productive soil, that's up front. That we make intelligent decisions rather than cutting the deals over how the land's going to be used. Initially, Grow Africa, World Economic Forum, rejected that. They said, great idea, we love it, we'll get to that later, we want to cut the deals first. What happened was a small group of these companies were approached with the hypocrisy of that attitude and said, basically, you cannot afford to do that. You cannot afford to do that because of your license to operate. You give up your license to operate if you move that way. You need to actually encourage sustainability up front. And so a schism arose within this group. And the result is now the efforts on Grow Africa are incorporating vital signs, sustainability up front. But there is a battle going on right now between the big players. And the pressure is on us all to keep the pressure on them. through social media and communications to do the right thing. And absolutely an essential part of that is to provide them with the tools. We cannot just say, go pick the right path. They don't know the right path. We have to provide the decision tools, the knowledge to be able to make a right turn instead of a left turn. And the way we do that is by actually investing in research that is applied, in tools that can be used, so that when you have a head of state that says, I'm really interested in accounting for all my biodiversity and my ecosystem services, you can give them that tool, or give her that tool, and say, this is how you evaluate your ecosystems and the products and the services that they provide. If we can provide those tools, and that's really the challenge, if we can give those tools and we can maintain that pressure, we actually have a chance of fast action, not slow action. And I think that that's really what we are all here to talk about. We need action fast. We need fast, important, big, national level demonstrations that we can design ecosystems that will continue to thrive, we can change production, and that can result in the well-being of people. And I'd love to describe some specifics, but I feel intense pressure on my left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I hope that all the efforts will finally lead to making farmers, small farmers, more independent and not more dependent. And that is the main point. Even if we provide the tools, we have to make sure that with those tools they can act independently. And I still have my doubts, and we may discuss this, on the real thinking behind the action of the big companies. They still have their model of linear growth of 2% per year minimum, and they do not have changed their attitude to what actually is growth. And I think we need to define growth differently. Nothing against growth, we need growth, but what kind of growth? That's the question to me. And now we have Anne, and I pronounce it the proper way, 200, 300 years ago, Anne, it was Tutwiler. You probably say Tutwiler. And Anne is the Director General of Biodiversity International, and she brings with her excellent qualification for that position because she has been working in the public sector, in the private sector, and in the civil society sector. She was, at the beginning of her career, together with as Deputy Director General with the Food and Agriculture Organization, and then spent some time as Office of the Secretary of the US Department of Agriculture, and then to a foundation, the William and Floral Ewald Foundation. And I think then she learned really the needs of those NGOs that would be working with her. And also in the trade-wide agricultural trade, she led a think tank for the government relations for an international soy and grain processing company. And when I said to her, now you know it all, you know all the science, she says, well, I have a fainted idea of what it is, but I don't know it all. And it's up to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be here. The questions we're discussing today are critical, as we've been hearing all day. How do we find sustainable, resilient, environment-friendly, safe, nutritious, and productive solutions to feeding our growing global population? And despite the impressive advances in productivity we've had over the last 60 years, as we've heard, FAO actually reports we have 885 million people who are still food insecure. And as the previous speaker just said, for a long time, our approach to feeding people was based on arithmetic. As if we increase productivity, if we increase production, we will reduce hunger. And I think now what we need to think about is calculus. We need to think about how we can feed people, but at the same time, help manage risks, improve resilience, enhance nutrition and livelihoods. So agricultural biodiversity, which is the universe that my organization works on, has to be the basis for food and agricultural production. The mission of my organization is to ensure that we conserve and sustainably use this agricultural biodiversity to solve these problems that we've been discussing today. So nearly 40% of the world's arable land is dedicated to the cultivation of 3 crops, wheat, rice, and maize, which also account for about 60% of the world's global intake from plants. As you can see from this graph, we have about 7,000 crops that have been used for food that we know of by humans and throughout history. Of those 3 crops I mentioned account for 60% of our daily calories. And if you add another 12 crops that include animal species, we get to about 75% of our production. So we have highly concentrated consumption patterns and highly concentrated production patterns. In addition, these 3 crops account for about half of the entire research budget of the International Agricultural Research Centers, of which we are a part. The funding that comes directly on the issues of biodiversity is about 4%. Now, the issues we've been talking about today indicate that might be somewhat unbalanced. So today for lunch, we had quinoa salad, which unfortunately I didn't see until after I had eaten. And we know there's been a huge quinoa boom as a result of this year of quinoa and work that my organization and others have been doing for the last decade in the Andes. However, there are 3,000 varieties of quinoas in existence, but we are eating only 2 that have been commercialized and are in the export market. So one single variety makes up about 40% of global production. Virtually all of banana exports rely on a few varieties known as the Cavendish or dessert banana, whereas there are about 500 different varieties that are known to be cultivated and consumed in more than 120 countries throughout the tropics, and we think there may be as many as 1,000 varieties of bananas, yet we focus on the one that is the most traded. In Asia, where 90% of the world's rice is produced and consumed, the number of rice varieties being grown has dropped from thousands to just a few dozen. In Thailand, for example, half of the cultivated area for rice uses only 2 varieties. And I was just in Washington earlier this week and heard that Burma is considering planting hybrid rice, which, great, no problems with hybrid rice, but the worry is that it could crowd out the thousands of varieties of native rice species that Burma has. If I could have the next, I only have two slides, okay. So this is a map of where we know we have high regions of biodiversity and biodiversity hotspots. And as was said by our keynote speaker, there's no escaping the fact that where we have those regions of high biodiversity happen to be the same regions where we have high incidences of poverty. And I guess one interpretation could be we should plant the world with corn and then we wouldn't have any more poverty. But I like to think the other interpretation is that we need to work with these poor farmers to make sure that we are using and conserving the agricultural biodiversity that we have left. So this is the group of farmers that we are working with are those who are in these areas who are the custodians of this agricultural biodiversity. But I think what's an important understanding that is coming out of my organization is that farmers will not conserve these varieties unless they find uses for them, unless there is some utility to those varieties, and that's what we're helping to discover and uncover. So let me give you a few examples of the work we're doing to make this a little more real. We talked about needing more stories, and I'm all in favor of good stories. So last year, Biodiversity worked with Save the Children UK and the National Museums of Kenya, with support from the Gates Foundation, to look at the cost and quality of diets. We studied how 5 wild and neglected species, neglected from the perspective of research, can reduce the cost and improve the nutrient content of modeled diets using something called the linear programming model. What we found was by adding these seasonably available foods, which happened to be free because they were wild foods, the diets were significantly less expensive, reducing the daily cost of feeding a 1 to 2-year-old child by 64% during the dry season. Now, we've heard from Tim and others saying, you know, sometimes the message comes across that we want more expensive food. And I think it's true in many cases that a good diet can be a more expensive diet, but what we're trying to show is that actually a good diet can be a cheaper diet. And I think we need to get those messages across. This diet that we found with the supplements of these 5 underutilized foods also happened to meet the daily nutrient requirement for women and children in this area of Kenya. In addition to looking at nutrition, we look at livelihoods and how biodiversity can help improve livelihoods of rural communities by identifying crops that can be brought to market and helping to build the linkages to get those crops to market. And marketing these crops is not the same as developing a maize value chain. It's very, very specific, and you need very specific understanding of those markets and specific partnerships with, sometimes with restaurants, sometimes with retail outlets, sometimes with wet markets. So it's a very, very difficult activity. But in Bolivia and Peru and India, we've been working with the support of the International Fund for Agricultural Development to enhance the conservation of traditional grains that happen to be high in proteins and micronutrients. In Bolivia, we worked with farmers to increase the production of Andean grains by 80% and the marketing opportunities by 80% and production by 40%. And these grains are much higher in vitamin C, iron, and they are drought tolerant to boot. And this is much higher in nutrition than the crops that are traditionally being grown in this area. In India, we've been working with with millet growers, where we've helped to increase their yield by 70% and their income by 30%. And small millets are much higher vitamin B, calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium, etc. We've also been working to show farmers that biodiversity can help in their agronomic practices. In Costa Rica, we found that complex landscapes, which utilize agroforestry, can save more than half of coffee harvest that is lost to pests. We also see benefits to soil regeneration and fertility over time. We've already talked about pollination, but I'll just say that the pollination services to coffee production in Costa Rica has been valued at about $60,000 per farm per year, whereas the very lauded Costa Rican Environmental Services Program pays farmers only 10% of that amount to maintain the biodiversity. So it's important that we realize that sometimes maintaining biodiversity actually provides a market benefit. I just want to briefly, I see my warning light over here. So because we've just seen what's happened with the recent typhoon in Philippines, some of the research that we have done in the past looked at what happened in Central America after the Hurricane Mitch, where we found that farms that had diversified with cover crops, intercropping, and agroforestry suffered less damage from hurricanes than the neighboring crops. And with Hurricane Ike, we found that those farms exhibited only a 50% loss instead of a near 100% loss of neighboring farms. And more importantly, those diversified farms bounced back more quickly. I want to conclude with talking about an initiative that we have launched with support of the Christensen Fund called the Bridging Agriculture and Conservation Initiative, where we're trying to bring these two communities together who often, as we've heard, don't talk to each other because one's focusing totally on production and the other's focusing on conservation. And we have a group of scientists who are working to pull together a meta-analysis of where we can see that these ecological intensification methods can also improve yield, can also address climate change and other efforts. So it's not trying to highlight where there are synergies in these agronomic practices and trying to see where we can minimize the trade-offs. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think this example shows that it is not really like we heard yesterday from somebody saying, here are we humans and here is nature. We are part of nature. And whatever damage we do to nature, we do to us. We have to make us aware of that. And biodiversity, we are part of biodiversity. And if we use it properly, as you said, it's an advantage for us. If we destroy it, it's a disadvantage for us. Well, the next speaker is a biologist, and when I talked to him, he said, well, I was concerned about soils, about ecosystem change, and I worked in peatlands, and I said, well, then you were also concerned about climate, because 36% of our carbon of the world is in peat. And we have in Germany, just to tell you the ridiculous situation, our government has a law to protect moors, but we import 900 million cubic meters of peat from Estland, from Litauen, and from Russia. How ridiculous that situation is. I mean, this is so, so unbelievable that you... But he is now actually, I would say you must be Mr. RSPB, because you started as a C 1988 as the first conservation officer and worked since then with RSPB. And I think that is an important organization, not only for Great Britain, I know for the world. And all my friends from our bird protection agency, they have actually renamed themselves in Germany, as you know. They're not only birds, they say nature and environment is the group. And birds are an indicator. That's the argument. And we have for long said, we don't need special protected areas, actually. We do use and protection at the same area. And that's the best what we can do, actually, for biodiversity, for agriculture, and for us. And now it's up to you. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for that. Actually, my associations there at RSPB go back a bit earlier than when I started as a member of staff. So when my mum joined me as a junior member of the RSPB, the period since then, we have been losing in Britain, in terms of breeding birds, the total number of breeding birds has been declining at 1 every 8 minutes in the whole time that I've been a member of the RSPB. And this is a pattern that is reproduced across the whole of Europe. And it's true for all of the taxa for which we have data. We are degrading the trophic structure and dismantling food webs. If you look globally, and this is a busy diagram, and I'm not worried if you can't read it all, you can find it on BirdLife International's website, The State of the World's Birds. In the middle, 1,313 bird species, 1 in 8 of all the bird species of the world threatened with extinction. And around that state are the pressures, and you will see in your top left, agriculture contributes to nearly 3/4 of all of those declines. This is quite an international audience, but can I just ask, how many of you know the traditional English carol, The 12 Days of Christmas? Have you heard of it? Yeah? Well, in which case you will know your true love sent to you 2 turtle doves. The trajectory of decline of turtle doves in this country at the moment means that currently the rate is they will be extinct in 7 years' time. On the 2nd day of Christmas 2019, the turtle dove risks becoming a folk memory. Our research shows that on the breeding grounds in the UK here, it's intimately connected in terms of its breeding success with the decline of wildflowers. And it's a migratory species, so right now, just leading up to Christmas, a lot of these turtle doves will be down in West Africa, south of the Sahel, where it's clear they're dependent and closely linked with extensive agricultural systems. As we heard a moment ago, the decline in biodiversity in ecosystems, exemplified by birds, is a really powerful indicator of all the negative externalities that we've been talking about over the last 2.5 days associated with agricultural systems. And I think this conference has made a powerful case for saying that the global food system is broken and we need to start building a new narrative. We need food that is healthy for people and for the planet. We need to adapt our food system so that it contributes to the true wealth of nations. That is where the balance sheet for natural capital is positive. That's one. We need to adapt the food system so that it builds true profit for shareholders and avoids risks and stranded assets. And thirdly, a food system that's adapted to provide true choices for people who are empowered through information to create the future, to help create the future they want through the food they buy. Now, the idea of natural capital is not that new. In 1789, famous naturalist Gilbert White in this country, writing about the natural history of Selborne, talked about the economy of nature. But what is new is the combination of economics and science, non-market valuation techniques, and what we're now able to do around ecosystem services and structure and model our knowledge about those. And combined, they make a powerful tool in our toolkit. And there's some positive, very practical examples of these concepts. We heard about this in a workshop earlier in this conference. The regulation of water pricing in England and Wales, now a privatised set of utilities. The regulatory pricing mechanism provides the ability for water customers, through their bills, to pay farmers to restructure their businesses and their farms and invest in natural capital that replaces more expensive engineered end-of-pipe solutions. And at least one major water company now believes that re-engineering of ecosystems is going to be the main way they keep their water bills down in the future. And you'll be aware that there's huge public debate on the cost of living here in the UK at the moment. But we need to recognise there are limits to the natural capital concept. There are technical difficulties, and some of these are being worked on in the next phase of the National Ecosystem Assessment in this country. For example, how cultural services are valued. But we also, and I think we've heard this, so particularly yesterday, we need to distinguish between public utility and societal values. Sorry, I've gone past two on. Societal values. What is the value of childhood? And what is the human cost of the rapid disconnection between people and nature? We need to build new markets, but we have to recognise there's limits to the voluntary approach. There's been a recent pilot study down the south coast of England that shows that if farmers are going to be paid to lower their nitrogen load into Poole Harbour, which will enable homes to be built that currently can't be because of the sewage effluent that would add to the load, then it's going to require active government. And as Ken very rightly pointed out this morning, government intervention is needed to change the size and shape of subsidies. The so-called reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy and its translation into the UK mean that the distortion between the public interest and public policy is growing. And this is shown in this slide where the solid blocks going up is the growing investment needed for biodiversity commitments, international EU commitments, and the Water Framework Directive. And these are the various options in terms of the small part, 10% of the Common Agricultural Policy, that actually addresses and helps farmers deliver the public goods that are associated for them. The challenge that we've all been discussing is about to get much greater. And we've heard various timelines. The one that really worries me the most is the nearest. By 2030, the pressure that humanity will be putting on the state of nature will be going up by some 40 to 50%. And it's taken us 5,000 years of agriculture to get to this point, and the next 17 years it's going to go up by 40 to 50%. It's quite clear this is too big for any one sector. I think what this conference has established is that we need a clear, shared picture of our journey, where we are now and where we're going to get to. And then we need a map of how we're going to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Precise, clear, within time. Congratulations. Well, we have now some time for discussion, and I think it is very important that we remind ourselves what we want is actually at the end of this 3 days that we have a plan for action. We want to do something. We don't want to lose momentum, because if we go away, everybody's back in the daily business and things fainting away. So let's concentrate our discussion and questions into that direction now, that we at the end come to a conclusion, say, yes, we are going to do something and set something into action. I open the discussion questions for all of the speakers, from Pavan to the last. I take 2 here. First, the lady in the back, and then you. 3.
Hi, is this on? Yes? No? Hi, my name's Rebecca. I've just graduated from a degree in agriculture and rural development.
If you keep the microphone up there, then we can...
Okay, sorry. I've kind of got a question for Pavan, but also to all of you. You're kind of suggesting that we should reorientate the system and shift our DNA. However, having done a lot of stuff on path dependency, especially in India, and knowing that it's mainly replacing the policy and maybe greening it, a new green revolution, a greener revolution, what are the costs of actually reorientating? Has that been taken into account in studies? Because at the moment we're talking about the externalities within one system and the alternative, but not the path to get there and the costs of that. And is that something that you've discussed?
Thank you. Next question. Microphone, please, here.
I have a question for Pavan. It seems that we look at externalities as something that can be quantified, and a lot of what we do about them is develop methods to get to some kind of a quantity that we can relate to. And usually what happens is that we get scared because it's so huge. But I don't hear the same level of insistence on what do we do with that number. I think even if it's didactical, I think it would be useful to just say, these are the 4 things that you do to internalize. Otherwise, we get into this notion that you internalize the externality by increasing the cost of the food or whatever the product might be. And we, I think, agree that's not the only one. So what are the other ways? And I think that as we think about the way forward, it would be good to be clear about what are some of these options for internalizing externalities, at least for the food sector in particular.
Thank you. There was more than one question.
I have just one quick question for Peter Seligmann. Given how fast the trends are in terms of ecological degradation and loss of species, and how difficult it is going to be to resolve the food system for all the reasons that we have been discussing. So we have an urgency and at the same time a challenge for how to address these root causes of degradation. I mean, as a conservationist, what do you think about that? I mean, how should we look at this dilemma, and how do we should distribute our resources to ensure that at the end we don't continue losing species, because you can repair ecosystems to some extent, but species don't come back.
Okay, there was one here at the end, the lady there.
Hi, Lauren Blake. Pavan and Peter both made very accurate and important points about our kind of current global system being really, really dominated by corporations now. Therefore, maybe is one of the ways forward, and how would we go about this, is trying to convince these corporations to adopt true cost accounting. How do we make it beneficial to them, so that is, if we can't change the fact that they're dominating, then how do we get them to adopt true cost accounting?
Okay, take three more. One was here. The one late, no, the gentleman there. That, not you. And then two up there. And then we go in the round here. Yeah, it's you. Yeah.
Thank you. Jeff Tansey. A couple of points. One, I wonder if talking about these as externalities is actually part of the problem. Because it's like drugs. Drugs don't have side effects, they have effects. It's our economics and the way it's structured that has the effects. And maybe we should be thinking more deeply about the nature of the economics that we've got, because this is part of the problem. Secondly, we actually are not really addressing the issues of power and the mechanisms by which the powerful maintain and extend that power. And what we've seen in corporate structures is the ability to rewrite the rules of the world through, for example, the rules on intellectual property in the World Trade Organization, through the rules in these new economic partnership agreements, which allow companies to sue governments to do the kind of things that you're talking about. So I hope you're thinking about those issues as well, because without addressing those and putting them in a framework of equity, which many governments don't believe in.
What are your questions, actually?
They're points for them to say, are you thinking about these? Because if you're not, you're missing part of the picture.
Okay. I guess that was a statement for all of us, or was it for somebody specially? For all of us. For all of us. Okay. Then the two gentlemen there. First, the one on the left.
Christopher Bielenberg. Addressed primarily at Peter Seligmann, actually. Thank you, Peter, for your encouragement that corporations were taking a more positive approach due to their enlightened self-interest. Unfortunately, I think the reality is, having had experience of some of these companies myself, is that the life cycle of the average chief executive in these large corporations is really quite short. They have a very short lifespan and a relatively short mission. By contrast to that, non-executive boards have a responsibility to long-term shareholders, to pension funds, and therefore they have a fiduciary duty to respect long-term success and therefore the long-term sustainability of those businesses. There seems to be a fundamental mismatch in that. In that connection, I was happy to hear from all the talks that we've heard today that nobody has really mentioned the alleged new technologies that are going to save the world from poverty, and nobody has even referred to them in this whole conversation over the last 3 days with any great detail, which I think is massively encouraging, because what we're saying is actually by changing the processes, the systems, the education, and changing the biodiversity, we will lead to the shortage, the elimination of the shortages of food without the help of Monsanto or anybody else.
Thank you.
Guy Duke. I've got a question for Mike, actually. Mike, you showed some appalling figures on loss of bird diversity in England, in the UK. And you also showed a very interesting graph, which I've not seen before, showing the disparity between the resources available under agri-environment, under the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and the amount that is required to safeguard biodiversity. And approximately, your graph showed that we're missing about half of what we need. Now, as you know, the government has put forward a proposal for offsetting, which we've calculated for the recent Ecosystem Market Task Force, would bring forward resources which would equal the agri-environment payments, so another 400 or 500 million a year. So where do you, as a conservation group, stand on this? There has been quite a lot of radical green voices in the press against the prospect of offsetting, but there is a potential there to revolutionize conservation in the UK.
Thank you. I think that question with regard to corporations was more or less to everybody, because I think everybody can say something, but maybe we start with you then, Peter, and then have the others also have a point on that.
So I guess there are two ways that I look at the not only the role that corporations can play, but why I believe that it is there, and it is evident, or it will shortly be evident, that it is in their enlightened self-interest to do a much better job, a much more responsible job. Supply chains are threatened. Availability of resources are threatened. The last thing that any company wants is a lack of predictability, unless it's in the hedging business, and there are some that are in that, where they don't really care, is insecurity. So I think that the two things that have really driven very poor corporate behavior has been the lifespan of the CEO, and I think that's accurate, and has been the quarterly report, which really drives kind of a need to have a short-term positive return. Enlightened self-interest means that you're looking at from the board's perspective, is that you're looking at kind of the long-term value of that particular institution. And that is directly connected to behavior. It's directly connected to the public understanding and appreciation, which is connected to social media, and it's connected to your license to operate, and that's why I think that we're seeing a shift in companies, some companies, thinking through these issues. The other part of this is companies operate within a context, and that context is a geography. And what is really crystal clear is that African nations, for an example, it could be South Pacific Islands, and it could be Asian nations, it could be any nation. They are really concerned about their own future. And they can set rules and they can change rules. And what we are seeing, and I'm experiencing this whether it's in Indonesia or whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa or whether it's in the South Pacific, are leaders, communities saying that we need to take control over what happens with our own resources. We can no longer be mined, extorted, destroyed by external forces. And that is an extraordinarily important transition. And all you have to do, if you want to understand the pressure that's on a country to do a better job, is look at what's happening in the Ukraine right now.
Okay.
And that happens all over the world.
Good. I think we get the same question now. You have two more questions to answer later, but I go first to Pavan. And if you could answer those two questions as well as the question of role of corporations. And then I come back to you for the two other questions.
Sure. I'll try and combine my answers, so apologies if it may not be too specific on. Now, there were two questions, in fact, three on the what next, as I see it. Guillermo, you phrased it as, after the scare, what? So actually the scare, which is from the size of corporate externalities, is the first point of educating the corporate management of their true impacts and bringing them to the space in which Peter's comments go, which is essentially what I call stakeholder capitalism. The need for awareness by the corporation's management that the days of shareholder capitalism will need to change. You need to think beyond that. There are issues to do with the brand, with customers, with social media, with ultimately the social license to operate. But the second dimension of that change that will happen is the realization that actually externalities today are costs tomorrow. And these externalities can be internalized, as we say, in other words, become costs, in broadly two different ways. One is through event risk, and the other one is through regulatory risk. Event risk is what happened to BP. As a result of their actions and their neglect, and as a result of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, they had to put in a $20 billion provision. Their capital stock suffered a loss of something like $70 billion over the first, and they're still paying fines which have totaled up to an estimated $40 billion. So the assessment of externalities of that oil spill, which was in the order of $60 to $300 billion, was actually not off the charts. It was kind of reasonable. So that's event risk approach. And the other is regulatory risk, and His Royal Highness talked about in his speech the issue of the polluter most definitely does not pay. But the polluter will pay so long as one knows what they're supposed to pay and what for. So establishing the quantum of damage, the third-party costs of business, the externalities, basically is sometimes, and can be, a step towards change in regulation. And smart management and good management will always anticipate regulatory changes, because that's an exposure which is known in the jargon as regulatory risk, as in the risk of regulation changes that potentially destroys your bottom line. Self-interest, long-term self-interest, what Peter talked about. So these are the ways in which the sort of externalities language and logic and calculation converts into action at various stages in time. One final quick point, I think there was a question here on the, completely right, I mean the nature of economics, absolutely. The very fact that for so long the difference between price and value has been ignored, and now it's become almost a religion to do so, and the very fact that how can you call as externalities events and impacts which are so significant economically, and it's almost illogical to use that term anymore now.
Okay, thank you very much, Pavan. Mike, you also to the specific question you had, but also the role of corporations you see.
Yeah. Well, let me deal with the specific first, because that introduces another point. So I think the first thing to say, that graph I showed, I think it would be to conflating the point with offsets. I'll come back to that very briefly in a moment. The graph I showed, remember, that is only the money that is going into the public goods there from Common Agriculture Policy is only about 10% of the budget. There is bags of money available if government policymakers so determined to actually put towards the public interest of addressing the negative externalities of the food system we have. That is not the shortage, and that was my point about the distortion between public interest and public policy. But with regard to offsets, I think, again, just to be clear, essentially what we've got, and what I was talking about there, is a revenue problem. This is the cost of managing ongoing high-value sites. And indeed, high-nature value farming is one of the ways of addressing that. With regard to, in a sense, moving natural assets around, yes, there is a role for offsets. We certainly would agree with that. It is a bit like nuclear fusion, great in theory, difficult in practice. And so it has to be done, it's an approach that needs the right, measures around it, and I'm happy to discuss that outside. I think with regard to corporates, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I'd also go back to the point, I think, Pavan, you made this point, that we're in an era where I believe the societal change we're going through, politicians broadly will follow, not lead. I think business does have a role, but actually it's times like this when civil society, we have to make sure that we are helping hold the ring on the evidence base. As has been said over the last couple of days, we make that accessible to people, and we create the platform and space within which not only enlightens self-interest, but actually a sense of what is good and what is right to be done. Because you can look at the game theory modelling, and actually humans are innately more altruistic than game theory says. And at the end of the day, we're going to need negotiators at multilateral talks to be there believing they've got to do this for their kids, not just for national self-interest.
Thank you. And then, how do you see the role of corporations in your work?
Well, let me talk about the role of corporations more generally. I think there are 2 points on the corporates that haven't been made. And one is that in addition to being concerned about their supply chains, there's also a concern about investment risk. So when a company that's highly dependent on water, like a Nestle or a Pepsi-Cola, is starting to look at making an investment in any country, they want to know what the water situation is going to look like in 30, 40, 50 years, because they're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. They also want to know what the situation is going to look like in terms of endangered species, because they know that could cause them to have to stop operating or change how they're operating. So I think we also need to think beyond just the supply chain focus that we've been talking about here. And the other point I would make is that the company that I used to work for had decided that it really does care about the sustainability of supply chains. The CEO was there for a long time, but told me he was having real difficulty getting that vision translated down to the actions of the managers on a day-to-day basis, because they didn't know how to set the incentive structure for those managers to do the right thing. So even though the corporation at the high level had the vision and were messaging it as they needed to do, they couldn't get the traction that they wanted to. On this question of sort of what do we do, I've been surprised at how little we've talked about environmentally damaging subsidies. And when we look at the U.S. Farm Bill, for example, the cap, for example, what was just shown in Thailand, the fertilizer subsidies in India, if we just got rid of some of these environmentally damaging subsidies, we would be far down the road in dealing with these issues. And it seems to me that given the budget pressures that a lot of our countries are under right now, this is a good time for all of this community to start putting even more pressure on that conversation. I will say one more thing. This week or next week, the trade ministers are meeting in Bali to try to finish this long-standing, long-expiring Doha round. And one of the things that escapes mention is that the developing countries are arguing that they should not have to have any disciplines on their subsidies. Now, in a way, yes, that's important because they need to be investing in roads and infrastructure and all the things that you need to be productive. But they're getting a pass on some of these environmentally damaging subsidies. And I think we really need to start paying more attention to that going forward, because many of these countries are going to have the money to put into subsidies, and we don't want them to go the wrong direction.
Thank you. We have two more questions to Peter, but please be brief, because we had all kind of secondary speeches. You had two more questions, or did you answer everything, you think?
No, I think Guillermo asked me a question, which with the acceleration of extinction rates and the loss of species, do we have time to take our eye off the ball of protection while we go through the transition into sustainability? The obvious answer is no. We don't. We can't. We have to, let's put it this way, we have to multitask. And the multitask basically means that we have to secure places that are reservoirs of natural capital or ecological diversity as we go through the transition into sustainable production. And to achieve that, we have to be able to more effectively make the arguments as to why we need those reservoirs of natural capital secured. That means we have to be able to explain what do they provide for people? What do they provide for the wealth, health, survivability, livability of our societies? And that's the reason that we did the flip at CI to go from focusing on the protection of human well-being and supporting human well-being as opposed to biodiversity, because we felt we have to really focus on that argument that, that gives the politician the cover for being able to actually, and the understanding of why you have to take an action to protect the place. We cannot be only focused on one. And if we are just focused on one, if we just focus on protection, we're not going to make the transition we have to make in the way development takes place. And if we just focus on development, by the time we get that thing fixed, there's not going to be ecological resilience left. So that's the answer.
Okay, thank you. We are actually out of time. And I want to finish on time. So unfortunately, I cannot allow you any more questions, because we had questions actually as speeches and we had answers as speeches. The discipline was not very good on question and answers, I must admit. We do it more strictly, actually. Allow you 3 sentences as an answer. But I think one important message is here, and it's 2 directions. One, which I'm not really very much in favor that we need more and more and more data. We do need some more data. But on the other hand, I think we could have this old Indian proverb that says, if you think you are approximately right, do something. Instead of being after years of research, exactly wrong. And that's the situation we have. I think we need to act on one side and need to get more data on the other side. We cannot do it either or. I think we have to do both. And that is very important for us. But the key to me is still, and you all said that we need to get this message to those who can really act. And the message, I agree, is through civil society. Because politicians, they change their mind, they change their behavior. And I'm not really, in contrast to some of you here, the great believer in the real change of companies. I do not believe it. From my knowledge, I know a lot of companies, that is a lot of greenwashing and lip service. And I'm really hoping they will do what you have seen that they will. I'm very doubtful. So we need to work on politicians on one side and on the companies as consumers on the other side. Those are two. Thank you very much, and we are back after the break.